In Paul's Pisidian Antioch sermon in Acts 13, he uses David as an illustration, as we've already seen. And in verse 36, he says this. He says, David served God's purpose in his own generation and fell asleep. You know, that'd be a good epitaph for your tombstone, wouldn't it? I can't think of anything I'd rather have said about me when life is over, that I served God's purpose in my generation and fell asleep. There's some questions we need to ask ourselves, and the first one is this. Am I a servant? Listen to what he said. He said, David served. Of all the things he could have said about King David, he said David was a great administrator. He was an unbelievable motivator of men, gathered those hundreds of motley men to Ziklag and those other places. He was an incredible leader, administrator, fundraiser, raised all the money to build the temple. But of all the things Paul could have said about David, he said David served. You see, David knew the way up was down and the way down was up. And David served. And I love this Greek word that says he served. The noun is huperetes. It's a compound word from a preposition meaning under and a verb that means to row, like you're rowing a boat. And so what he says here is this: David served. David was an under-rower. He didn't have to be on deck barking orders all the time. Many of you have seen those pictures of those Greek sailing vessels of that first century world, those big wooden sailing vessels, and outside the sides of the ship are those holes with those long big oars that came out, and down underneath the deck, down there were those slaves, the huperetes, the under-rowers, chained to those oars and rowing the boats. And that's the term that the Bible uses when it describes how David served. David was an under-rower. You know, there's a verse over in 1 Kings 12 that says, if you'll be a servant to them and serve them and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever. You're never more like Jesus Christ than when you're serving others. Do you remember the conversation in the upper room? The night before he was crucified, the night they were having the Seder meal, the night the Lord instituted the Lord's Supper, communion that we've been sharing for 2,000 years. Do you remember what happened that night in that room around the table in the Gospels? The disciples got into an argument. And what were they arguing about? This is an incredible thing. They got into an argument about which of them would be the greatest in the coming kingdom. Can you imagine that? Can you think about that? That night, in that room, in that setting, they got into an argument with each other about which of them would be the greatest in the coming kingdom. And it was at that moment that the greatest of all of them, the Lord Jesus, got up from the table and he girded himself with a towel and he knelt beside each of them and washed their feet. Whose feet needed washing the most that night? Whose feet, in just a matter of hours, were going to be nailed fast to a cross? And you know what? His were the only feet that left that room, as far as we know, that night, that were not washed. We're never more like Jesus than when we're washing others' feet. So when we come into dry dock and try to remove some of those things in our life that keep us from sailing through the waters of the Christian experience, ask yourself this question: am I a servant? Am I a servant? You see, it says David served. Another question we need to ask is this: do I have the sense of calling on my life? Then we need to ask ourselves this question: am I a contemporary servant? And then we need to ask ourselves another question: do I have an eternal purpose? Because Paul said David served God's purpose in his own generation and fell asleep. Somewhere there's something for you to do that no one can do like you can do. And you're never more like Jesus than when you're washing someone's feet. Be a servant.